One of the most important philosophical tools of the last century is John Rawls' veil of ignorance, which asks how a person would want to organize society if the person were placed in what Rawls called the original position. But behind the veil of ignorance, this person would not know, according to Rawls, quote, his place in society, his class position or social status, nor does he know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence and strength, and the like, nor, I'll add, his or her gender. Rawls argued that behind the veil of ignorance, people would agree to a much more egalitarian distribution of wealth. In particular, Rawls claimed that those in the original position would all prefer a maximin strategy, which would maximize the prospects of the least well-off person in society. His difference principle permits inequalities in the distribution of goods only if those inequalities benefit the worst-off members of society. Rawls's particular answers to the thought experiment have been criticized. For example, behind the veil of ignorance, if you had a choice between a distribution where everyone had $2 of wealth and another distribution where everyone had $1 million except for one person who had $1, which would you decide? Which would you prefer? I believe Rawls would argue that people would prefer the distribution where everyone had $2, everyone received $2. Harold Dempsett used an example like this to counter, though, that people behind the veil of ignorance might not be so risk-averse. In a world with 6 billion people, I might, from the original position, behind the veil of ignorance, take the chance of receiving only $1. But the idea that decision makers behind the veil of ignorance would make better and less biased choices has several real-world applications. Claudia Golden and Cecilia Rouse have shown that orchestras that auditioned musicians behind a screen started hiring substantially higher proportions of women. A literal screen of ignorance reduced bias. A crucial implication of Rawls is that having a decision maker know less can perversely improve decision making. Akhil Amar has argued that lawmakers today are somewhat analogously behind the veil with regard to regulation of the distant future. It would be difficult to get bipartisan consensus with regard to whether the tenure of Supreme Court justices should be limited today, because it's clear whether liberal or conservative justices are most likely to be affected by any mandatory retirement rule that took effect now. But it's close to impossible to predict the political impact of limiting judicial tenure 50 years from now, so it might be possible to find more bipartisan consensus for rules that only take effect in the future. The 22nd Amendment limiting presidents to serving 2 terms was easier to pass because it did, quote, not apply to any person holding the office of president when this article was proposed by the Congress, unquote. Adrian Vermeule has identified a host of constitutional and statutory veil of ignorance rules, which he defines as rules that suppress self-interested behavior on the part of decision makers by subjecting the decision makers to uncertainty about the distribution of benefits and burdens that will result from a decision. The take-home here is that Rawls's veil is not just a powerful thought experiment, it can lead to new ways to get better legal rules enacted. Now, as homework, can you identify provisions of the Constitution or statutes that might qualify as veil of ignorance rules?